If you find yourself drawn to the unease hidden in the margins of history, to the small details that unravel the fabric of what we thought we knew, then stay with me through what follows. Subscribe to this channel because the story I am about to tell will change the way you look at every old photograph you encounter. I promise you that. My name is inconsequential now. What matters is my profession, or what used to be my profession. I was a photographic conservator, a specialist in 19th century processes. I spent my days in climate-controlled archives, handling glass plate negatives with cotton gloves, my fingers stained yellow from decades-old developer residue that never quite washed clean, no matter how much I scrubbed. I restored albumin prints so faded they appeared as ghosts of themselves, coaxed images from collodion plates that had survived fires and floods and a century of neglect. I knew the smell of old fixative the way a sommelier knows wine, the particular sulfurous bite of sodium thiosulfate, the acetic tang of stop bath, the metallic sweetness of silver nitrate. I knew the particular must of decaying gelatin binders, the way silver nitrate left brown halos on paper that had been improperly washed 100 years before I was born. I understood these photographs. I respected them. I never imagined they could reach back. The portrait arrived at the archive in November, packed in acid-free tissue inside a wooden crate that still bore a shipping label from 1924, the ink faded to the color of dried blood. It had been part of an estate sale, one of those sprawling Victorian houses finally surrendered to demolition after sitting vacant for decades. The note from the acquisitions librarian said only, "Family portrait circa 1895, possible compositing, your assessment requested." The archive specialized in examples of early photographic manipulation, so the request was routine. Just another artifact to catalog, another technical curiosity to dissect and explain. I opened the crate in my workroom on a Thursday afternoon. The light outside was already failing, the November sun weak and watery through the reinforced glass windows. The smell hit me first, not decay exactly but something older. Hypofixer, yes, the sulfurous undertone of inadequately washed sodium thiosulfate, but beneath that, something else. Something organic and faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in a closed room. Like the air in a funeral parlor after the mourners have gone. The photograph was an albumin print, mounted on heavy cardstock with beveled gilt edges that had tarnished to the color of old brass. The studio mark embossed at the bottom read, Thorne and Wickham, Photographic Artists, Providence, Rhode Island. I had never heard of them, and I thought I knew every significant studio that had operated in New England during the wet plate era. The print was large, 11 by 14 inches, the standard size for a formal family portrait in the 1890s, the kind commissioned to mark significant occasions or displayed in the parlors of the aspiring middle class. 5 figures arranged in the conventional manner, father standing behind, one hand on the mother's shoulder as she sat in an ornate chair upholstered in dark velvet, 2 daughters flanking her, a young boy at her knee. Their clothing dated the image precisely, with the kind of accuracy only decades of study can provide. The father's frock coat and high collar, starched and severe, the fabric showing the particular sheen of wool broadcloth. The mother's leg of mutton sleeves, enormous and structured, the fashion that dominated the mid-1890s. The girl's sailor dresses, white and crisp with navy trim at the collars. The boy's velvet suit with its wide lace collar, the kind of feminine styling that would have been typical for a boy under 10. Spring of 1895, I estimated, perhaps early summer. The exposure had been long. I could tell by the stillness in their faces, that particular Victorian tension of people forced to remain motionless for 30 seconds or more while the camera lens gathered light onto the glass plate. Their eyes had the glassy quality of subjects staring at nothing, trying not to blink, trying not to breathe too deeply lest their chests blur in the final image. The father's jaw was clenched. The mother's hands gripped the arms of her chair. The children's faces held that artificial composure that comes from being told to hold very, very still, to be good, to not ruin the exposure that cost more than a week's wages. But something was wrong. I felt it before I saw it, that instinct conservators develop after years of work, the sense that an image is not quite right. A painting restored incorrectly, a sculpture whose proportions do not match the period, a photograph whose shadows fall at impossible angles. I positioned my illuminated magnifier over the print, a heavy brass tool with a ring of LED lights that mimicked natural daylight, and examined the image section by section. The lighting was competent, professional even. A large north-facing window to the left, its diffuse light modeling the faces with gentle shadows. Fill flash from a magnesium ribbon to the right to prevent the shadows from going completely black, a technique that required careful timing and often left burn marks on the studio ceiling. The backdrop was painted canvas, a generic parlor scene with suggestions of wallpaper and wainscoting, the kind of backdrop that could be rolled up and stored, used for dozens of families. Standard commercial work, technically proficient if not inspired. Then I saw the shoe. The boy's left foot, positioned slightly forward in the conventional manner for portrait sittings, wore a small leather boot with a row of buttons up the side. It was perfectly in focus, the stitching visible, a small scuff mark on the toe where he must have dragged it across a threshold or kicked at something in play. The kind of detail that makes an image real, that connects the viewer across decades to the moment of exposure. His right foot wore the same boot. Identical stitching. Identical scuff mark. In the identical position. Not mirrored, which would have been possible with the reversing properties of certain lenses or printing processes. Identical. The exact same boot, down to the grain of the leather, down to the way a single button caught the light and reflected it back toward the camera as a tiny bright point. My hand holding the magnifier began to shake. In 30 years of examining photographic prints, I had seen every kind of manipulation the Victorian era could devise. Double exposures that placed spirits beside the living, the ghostly forms translucent and glowing. Combination printing that assembled landscapes from multiple negatives, creating skies and foregrounds that had never existed in a single moment. Painted additions in oils or watercolors, faces brightened, clouds added, backgrounds transformed. Airbrush retouching with stencils and fine mist. Scratched emulsions, inked corrections, entire figures removed by careful overpainting. But this was different. This was a duplication so precise it could only have come from the same negative, the same exposure, the same exact moment of light striking silver halide crystals on a glass plate. Composite printing. They had photographed this boy twice on separate glass plates, developed and fixed both negatives, cut the resulting prints apart with surgical precision, and reassembled them on a single sheet of paper, masking the joins so carefully that only the accidental doubling of a shoe gave it. Why? But why? I spent the rest of that day examining the print, foregoing lunch, ignoring my phone, letting the light outside fade to full dark while I worked under the bright circle of my magnifying lamp. Under raking light, holding the print at an angle so the light skimmed across its surface, I found the join, a hairline discontinuity running vertically through the image, just to the right of the boy's body, barely wider than a human hair. It was masterful work. The background aligned perfectly. The perspective matched. Even the grain structure of the albumin, the way the egg white proteins had dried into microscopic patterns on the paper surface, continued without interruption across the seam. Someone had spent hours on this, days perhaps, using masking techniques that would not become standard practice for another 2 decades, innovations that should not have existed in 1895. I checked the boy's face, his hands, every detail of his figure visible in the photograph. No other duplications. His collar sat differently in each side of the composition, I realized with growing unease. The lace fell in slightly different folds. And his hands, one resting on his knee, the other at his side, were positioned at subtly different angles. This was not a simple doubling error. These were 2 separate exposures of the same boy in nearly, but not quite identical poses. That night I could not sleep. I lay in my apartment staring at the ceiling, listening to the radiator click and hiss, kept seeing that shoe. Kept asking myself why a studio would go to such extraordinary effort to composite a family portrait. Compositing was used for theatrical effect, for trick photographs showing impossible juxtapositions, for elaborate combination prints of landscapes where dramatic skies were married to carefully composed foregrounds, for architectural photography where multiple exposures at different times of day were combined to show both exterior and illuminated interior. Not for a straightforward family sitting. Never for something so conventional, so domestic, so ordinary. Unless the family was not straightforward. Unless they needed to appear ordinary when they were anything but. The next morning, I contacted the Rhode Island Historical Society in Providence. Their records of commercial photographers were extensive, maintained by volunteers who had spent decades tracking down every studio, every practitioner, every glass plate negative that survived. I spoke to an archivist named Helen, an elderly woman whose voice carried the particular enthusiasm of someone who has found their calling late in life. She was delighted to help. Thorne and Wickham had operated from 1889 to 1897, she told me, reading from index cards that had been typed on a manual typewriter decades ago. The partnership had dissolved acrimoniously. No images from their studio were known to survive except in private collections. Their studio building, located on Benefit Street in the heart of the Old City, had been demolished in 1932 to make way for a parking garage. But there was a note, added by a researcher in the 1970s in different handwriting, blue ink fading to gray. See Death Records, March 1895. Unusual circumstances. I requested the records. They arrived as digital scans 2 days later, on a Monday morning when freezing rain slicked the windows and the archive heating system could not quite keep up with the cold. I opened them in the low light of my workroom, the only illumination the blue glow of my monitor and the gray daylight filtering through the weather outside. March 17, 1895. Wickham, Samuel, age 7 years, 3 months. Cause of death, drowning, accidental. Body recovered from Seekonk River after 2 days. Identified by father, Jonathan Wickham, photographer. March 17, 1895. Thorne, Catherine, age 9 years. Cause of death, drowning, accidental. Body recovered from Seekonk River after 2 days. Identified by father, Robert Thorne, photographer. March 17, 1895. Thorne, Margaret, age 12 years, 1 month. Cause of death, drowning, accidental. Body recovered from Seekonk River after 2 days. Identified by mother, Anne Thorne. 3 children. Same day. Same cause. Same river. I looked at the photograph again, pulling it from the flat file where I had stored it, handling it with my usual care though my hands were shaking. The 2 girls. The boy. The sitting could not have taken place in the spring of 1895. Not all of them together. Not all of them alive. My hands were trembling as I returned to the magnifier, my breath coming short, the room suddenly too warm and too cold at once. This time I examined the girls with methodical care, fighting the urge to look away. The younger one first, 9 years old, Catherine, her face round still with childhood. Her face was slightly softer than her sister's, the focus not quite as crisp, the edges of her features bleeding ever so slightly into the background. I checked the depth of field, calculated the aperture from the sharpness of the background details, from the way the painted canvas behind them held or lost definition. At that f-stop, at that distance, both girls should have been equally sharp, both falling well within the plane of acceptable focus. Unless she had moved during the exposure, which would have been impossible to correct. Or unless she had been photographed at a different time, under different conditions with different equipment and composited in later. I found the seam. Another vertical join, this time running behind the mother's chair, concealed in the fold of her skirt where it pooled on the floor. And when I examined Catherine's hands, folded demurely in her lap in the pose young girls were taught for photographs, I saw that her right hand ended at the wrist. The left hand was there, perfectly rendered, every wrinkle in the knuckles visible, the nails clean and trimmed. But the right simply faded into the dark fabric of her dress. Not gradually, not as shadow would naturally fade, but with a sharp edge that had been retouched, blended with pigment or dye, made invisible to a casual glance but unmistakable under magnification. The room was very cold. My breath fogged in the air. I stood up from my workbench, stepped back from the photograph, felt the blood draining from my face. My breath came short and shallow. I told myself I was being irrational. Composite printing was not sinister. It was a commercial practice, widely used, well documented in the photographic journals of the period. Perhaps one child had been ill during the original sitting, laid up with influenza or measles, and the family had wanted the portrait to include them anyway. Perhaps they had brought the family back for a second session weeks later and combined the results. Perhaps the missing hand was simply damaged emulsion, a processing error, nothing more sinister than chemistry gone wrong in a darkroom 130 years ago. Except the death record said otherwise. Except 3 children had died on the same day, 1 month before this photograph was supposedly taken. Except I could now see, with horrible clarity, why the boy had been photographed twice. Why his shoes matched so perfectly. Why the joins were so carefully hidden. I thought of mortuary photography, that strange and ubiquitous Victorian practice that modern sensibilities found macabre but which was, in its time, utterly commonplace. I had restored hundreds of such images over my career. Infants in their mother's arms, eyes closed as if sleeping, sometimes with eyes painted onto the photograph to give the illusion of wakefulness. Adults in coffins, surrounded by flowers, dressed in their finest clothes for one final portrait. Children posed in chairs, their heads held upright by hidden stands clamped to the base of the skull, their bodies stiffened by rigor mortis or positioned by careful propping, their eyes sometimes left open, sometimes closed, sometimes replaced in the printing process with the eyes from an earlier photograph taken when they were alive. The thought came unbidden, unwanted, undeniable. What if this was a mortuary portrait in reverse? What if the living had been composited with the dead? What if this family had lost 3 children on a single terrible day and, mad with grief, had commissioned the photographers to create an image that denied that loss, that assembled a family whole again, that lied with such technical perfection that the lie might almost be believed? I left the workroom. I went home. I did not return for 3 days. But the photograph waited. Photographs are patient. They do not age, not in any way that matters. They do not forget. They hold their moments suspended in silver and light, and they wait for someone to look closely enough to see what is really there. When I came back on a Thursday morning with weak sunlight filtering through clouds, I brought equipment from my home office. A high-resolution digital scanner, capable of resolving details at 4,800 dots per inch, far beyond what the human eye could perceive even with magnification. Spectrum analysis tools to examine the light sources, to determine if the illumination in different parts of the image came from the same direction, the same time of day, the same weather conditions. Software used by forensic analysts to detect alterations in documents, capable of finding the slightest variations in grain structure, the telltale signs of separate negatives combined in printing, the evidence of retouching that might be invisible to direct examination. I scanned the print at maximum resolution. The file was enormous, nearly 4 gigabytes for a single image. My computer fan whined as the processor struggled with the data. On my screen, blown up to 10 times life size, the image became an alien landscape of silver particles suspended in albumin, every microscopic imperfection visible, every grain of the paper fiber revealed, every brush stroke of retouching paint exposed. I found 7 seams. 7 separate pieces, assembled like a puzzle, like a broken mirror reassembled so carefully that you would not see the cracks unless you knew to look. The father. 1 piece from a negative taken in good light, his face sharp and clear. The mother. 1 piece from a different negative, her face slightly softer, the light coming from a lower angle. The older daughter Margaret. 1 piece, the focus perfect, but her figure outlined by a halo of retouching that had blended her into the background, hiding the cut edge. The younger daughter Catherine. 1 piece with the hand removed, the fabric of her dress painted over the absence. The boy Samuel. 2 pieces spliced precisely at the waistline, the doubled shoe the only error. His upper body from 1 negative, his lower from another. 2 moments. 2 poses. Combined. The background. 1 piece, a painted canvas backdrop that showed signs of having been rephotographed, copied from another studio negative to provide a consistent setting behind the assembled family. Each element from a different negative. Each exposure made at a different time, under different lighting, perhaps even on different days. The lighting varied by degrees I could only detect through computer analysis. The shadow angles were wrong by fractions of degrees, the kind of discrepancy that would be invisible to anyone not looking with software and suspicion. The perspective was off by millimeters, the focal lengths not quite matching, suggesting different lenses or different camera positions for each separate element. Someone had photographed this family piecemeal over days or weeks and assembled them into a lie. A beautiful, technical masterpiece of a lie. A family portrait that showed 5 people who had never stood together in the same room at the same time. I worked backward through the death records, requesting everything Providence had on file for March and April of 1895. The details were sparse, the language carefully neutral in the way of official documents recording tragedies. A skating accident. The ice had broken on the Seekonk River during an early spring thaw. The 3 children had gone through together, holding hands, witnesses said, their screams carrying across the water to the far bank where a man walking his dog had heard them but could do nothing. The ice too weak to cross, the current too strong. It had taken 2 days to recover the bodies, dragging the river with hooks and poles, finding them finally a half-mile downstream, still together, Samuel's hand caught in Margaret's coat. The funeral had been held at the Thorne House, a private service, the coffins closed. The business partnership had dissolved 3 weeks later, articles of dissolution filed with the city on April 8. The same date, I realized with cold certainty, that someone had written in pencil on the back of the photograph. No record of the parents after 1896. Robert Thorne's name disappeared from city directories. The house on Benefit Street had been sold at auction. Jonathan Wickham, Samuel's father, had been committed to Butler Hospital. The family name vanished from Providence as thoroughly as if they had never existed, leaving behind only this one photograph, this one perfect lie. But the portrait remained, dated in pencil on the back, April 1895. 1 month after the children died. 1 month after they were pulled from the river, their clothes heavy with water, their skin like wax. 1 month to grieve. 1 month to conceive of this solution. 1 month to bring them back, if only as images, if only as silver and light. I should have stopped there. Should have written my assessment, recommended the print for the collection as an exceptional example of early composite technique, moved on to the next project in my queue. Instead, I became obsessed. I could not stop thinking about the technical achievement, the hours of work required, the grief that must have driven it. I needed to understand how it had been done with the materials available in 1895. Needed to replicate the process. Needed to see what the photographer had seen, standing in that darkroom, assembling the pieces of a family that no longer existed, trying to restore what had been lost. The archive had a darkroom in the basement, maintained for educational purposes and historical demonstrations. It had not been used in years, the old equipment sitting under dust covers, the bottles of chemicals disposed of or evaporated to nothing. I requisitioned new supplies from a specialty company in Rochester that still catered to die-hard film enthusiasts and historical photographers. Silver nitrate, potassium bromide, sodium thiosulfate, citric acid, acetic anhydride. I ordered sheets of baryta-coated paper manufactured using period-correct methods. I found gelatin dry plates from a boutique manufacturer in France that still made them for large-format photographers. I located a formula for collodion from an 1890s photographic manual, reprinted by Dover, and mixed it carefully in a ventilated hood, following instructions written before safety regulations existed. Gun cotton dissolved in ether and alcohol, potassium iodide added drop by careful drop, distilled water to control the viscosity. The smell of it brought tears to my eyes. Sharp and medicinal and wrong, like something that should never be inside a human body. I poured it into amber bottles and stoppered them tightly, feeling lightheaded despite the ventilation. I spent 2 weeks preparing the darkroom. I sealed light leaks with black tape and weather stripping. I tested the safe lights, the red and amber bulbs that allowed work to proceed without exposing light-sensitive materials. I built masking frames from brass strips and black mat board, precise to the millimeter. I mixed developers from formulas in century-old textbooks. Pyrogalol with sodium sulfite, the combination called alkaline pyro, that had been standard before modern developers were invented. I made fixing baths in stoneware crocks, dissolved the sodium thiosulfate in distilled water, tested the concentration with silver nitrate until the milky precipitate appeared and dissolved at the correct rate. The darkroom light was a candle in a ruby glass chimney, the same illumination Victorian photographers had used, safer than gas lamps, cooler than electric bulbs that did not yet exist. No temperature controls. No automated processing. Just the chemistry in the dark and my hands working by memory and feel. I told myself I was conducting historical research. That I needed to understand the technical achievement the Thorne and Wickham studio had accomplished. That this was legitimate scholarship, the kind of hands-on experimental archaeology that would produce a paper for a conservation journal, maybe even a presentation at a conference. I was lying to myself. I began printing on a Tuesday night in late February. The archive was deserted after 6 in the evening, the other conservators gone home, the security guard making rounds on a different floor. The heating system cycled off at 6, saving energy, leaving the building to cool through the night. By 8 o'clock, the darkroom in the basement was cold enough to see my breath in the ruby light. I worked by candlelight when the safe light was too bright, the red glow turning my hands the color of old meat, casting shadows that moved when I did not. I had found the original negatives or what was left of them, though I had not mentioned this in my acquisition report. They had been packed beneath the print in the bottom of the crate, wrapped in waxed paper that crumbled when I touched it. Glass plates, 4 inches by 5 inches, the collodion emulsion cracked and peeling, stable enough to survive a century but damaged beyond any possibility of printing. I could barely make out the images through the deterioration. Ghostly fragments, a hand here, a face there, pieces of a family taken apart and never properly reassembled. I copied them onto modern film stock first, using an antique view camera from the archive's collection, photographing each damaged plate against the light box, capturing what remained before it deteriorated further. I developed the copy film using period-correct processes, not because I had to but because I wanted to, because I needed to understand every step. Rodinal developer, its sharp smell filling the darkroom, glacial acetic acid stop bath that made my eyes water, hypofixer in a granite tray that had been old when my grandmother was young. The smell was overwhelming, filling my nose and mouth, clinging to my clothes and skin. Sulfur and vinegar and something beneath it, something sweet and organic like the smell from the original photograph, like rot concealed under perfume. The negatives dried hanging from wooden clothespins, swaying slightly in air currents I could not feel. I printed them one at a time onto the baryta paper, exposing each sheet under the light of a carbon arc lamp I had restored to working order. Its fierce light filtered through the original glass plates to create exposures that matched the quality of 1895. 30 seconds per exposure. The paper darkened slowly, the developing out process that had been standard before modern papers were invented, the image emerging like something rising from deep water, from a depth where light barely penetrates and strange things swim. I fixed each piece in the hypo bath, the fluid turning milky as it dissolved the unexposed silver salts. I washed them in trays of cold water from the basement tap, watched the water carry away the chemistry, clear the paper to pure white wherever the light had not struck. I hung them to dry from a line strung across the darkroom, watching them curl slightly as the gelatin contracted. And then I began to cut. The scissors were surgical steel, purchased from a medical supply company, sharp enough to split a human hair lengthwise. I cut along the pencil lines I had traced from the original seams, following the patterns I had mapped with the digital scanner. The paper curled as I worked, the gelatin emulsion contracting as it dried completely, trying to return to some original configuration. I weighted the pieces flat under panes of clean glass, let them rest for a day for 2 days until they lay perfectly flat and still. When I assembled them, weighted under glass, aligned as precisely as I could manage with straightedge and magnifier, I understood for the first time what the original photographer had done, what he had truly accomplished. The pieces fit together perfectly. Too perfectly. The edges aligned at the level of individual silver grains, microscopic particles matching across the cuts as if they had always been intended to separate and rejoin. The tonal values matched without adjustment, the light and shadow flowing seamlessly across the seams. It was as if I was not assembling separate photographs but reassembling a single image that had been broken apart by some force, some intention that existed before the photographs were taken. Or as if the separations had always existed. As if this family had never truly been whole, had always been fragments pretending to unity, held together by will and want and denial until the truth broke them apart. I made the final print on a Thursday night, exactly 2 weeks after I had started. The darkroom was colder than it had ever been. The candle flame bent sideways at an impossible angle as if pushed by wind, though the room was sealed and airless. My hands shook as I positioned the masked negatives one after another, covering and revealing sections of the printing frame, exposing portions of the same sheet of paper in sequence. Building the image in layers. One exposure for the father. One for the mother. One for each child. Each masked and timed and controlled, the way the original photographer must have worked, hunched over his printing frame by candlelight, assembling a family from fragments. When I lifted the final print from the fixer and held it under the red safe light, my hands submerged in the chemistry, the family looked back at me. But something had changed. The boy's shoe was no longer doubled. Both feet were visible now, clearly separate, properly aligned, as if I had somehow corrected the error that existed in the original. The girl's missing hand had returned, both hands now folded properly in her lap, complete and whole. The seams I had traced so carefully, mapped so precisely were gone. The image was seamless, continuous, perfect. Impossible. I told myself it was a trick of the light. I hung the print to dry, feeling the chemistry drip from the paper onto the floor, leaving the darkroom door open slightly to allow air circulation, and went upstairs to my office. I sat at my desk for an hour, not moving, watching the window gradually lighten with dawn. When I returned to the darkroom, the print was gone. The clothespins hung empty, swaying slightly. No paper on the floor beneath them, no sign it had fallen or been moved. Just gone, as completely as if it had never existed. But the original was there, the 1895 portrait from the archive, lying on my work table where I had left it the night before. Except it was not quite the same. The father's hand, which had rested lightly on the mother's shoulder, now gripped it. Tightly enough that the fabric bunched beneath his fingers, wrinkles radiating from his grasp. The mother's eyes, which had stared into the middle distance with the unfocused gaze typical of long exposures, now looked slightly to the side. Toward the camera. Toward me. Her pupils were too large, too dark, as if she had been sitting in darkness and the flash had caught her unprepared. And the boy, Samuel, the boy whose shoe had been doubled, now stood in a different position. Not much. Just a few inches to the left. But enough that the background behind him was now visible, a section of painted canvas that had been hidden before by his shoulder. Someone had written something on that canvas, low down near the baseboard of the false wainscoting. In small, careful letters painted with a fine brush. Too small for me to read without magnification. I picked up my loupe with hands that would not stop shaking, the heavy brass magnifier slipping in my grip. The words, painted in brownish pigment that might have been oil or watercolor or something else, said, "We are waiting." I dropped the loop. It hit the concrete floor, the lens shattering into fragments that scattered across the darkroom. I backed away from the photograph, stumbling, my hips striking the edge of the developer tray hard enough to slosh chemicals across the table. The candle I had left burning flickered wildly. In that moment of moving shadow and uncertain light, I saw the girl's hand, Catherine's hand, the one that had been missing and was now restored, curl slowly into a fist. I ran. I left everything. The darkroom door standing open. The candle burning. The spilled chemicals eating into the darkroom bench. The photograph lying on the table, its surface reflecting the candlelight. I drove home through the pre-dawn streets and sat in my car in the parking garage until the sun came up and the city woke around me and I could breathe normally again. I called in sick. 1 day. Then 2. Then a week. My supervisor left voicemails. Concerned at first, then annoyed, then coldly formal. I deleted them without listening to the ends. They fired me on Friday afternoon. Professional misconduct, the email said. Unauthorized use of archive materials. Damage to a historical photograph. I called the director. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice carefully controlled, the tone one uses with someone who might be unstable, who might become difficult. "You scratched a name into the emulsion," she said when I demanded to know what damage I had supposedly caused. Across the boy's face. Deeply enough to remove the albumin down to the paper fiber. "Your name. We'll need to discuss restoration costs and potential legal consequences." I had done no such thing. I told her so, my voice rising, panic making me shrill. She was silent for a long moment. "Come to the archive," she said finally. "Look at the photograph yourself. Then we'll talk." But I could not. I knew, even as I hung up the phone, that if I went back to the archive, if I looked at that photograph again, I would see it. My name. Scratched into the image in letters that exposed the paper fiber beneath the albumin, letters that might have been made with a pin or a knife or a fingernail. Permanent. Irreversible. A mark of possession, a claim, a signature on a contract I had never agreed to sign. I began to research the Thorne and Wickham studio in earnest then, all through that weekend and into the following week. Not through official channels, not through historical societies and carefully indexed archives, but through obituaries and asylum records and old newspaper articles that had been digitized but never properly cataloged, findable only through patient searching, through combining names and dates and reading hundreds of pages of microfilmed newsprint from 1895 and 1896. I found Jonathan Wickham first. Admitted to Butler Hospital for the Insane in May of 1895, 2 months after his son drowned. The admission notes, written in the crabbed copperplate handwriting of a 19th-century physician, were chillingly clinical. Patient exhibits severe melancholia and delusional thinking. Believes himself trapped within his own photographic work. Claims images move when unwatched. Refuses sleep, states darkness brings them closer. Has destroyed all photographs in his possession. Responds violently when presented with mirrors or reflective surfaces. Prognosis poor. He died there in 1897 at age 34. Cause of death, exhaustion and mania. The death certificate noted he had not slept more than an hour at a time in his final year, that he had worn his fingernails down to bleeding trying to scratch at the walls of his room, that in his final moments he had begged the attendants to keep the lights burning, to never let him be in darkness, because they came in the darkness, they reached for him from the darkness, the images wanted him back. Robert Thorne had vanished. No death record. No asylum admission. No forwarding address. Just gone sometime in late 1896 after the studio closed. The last mention of him I could find was a small advertisement in the Providence Journal, November 12, 1896. R. Thorne, photographer. Available for commissions. Specializing in memorial work. Posthumous portraits a specialty. Discretion and sensitivity assured. No assignment too difficult. Memorial work. Mortuary photography. The dead posed as living. Or the living posed with the dead. Or something worse, something in between, something that used the magic of photography to deny death, to reverse it, to reach across the boundary and pull back what had been lost. I found one more document, late on Tuesday night, my eyes burning from the screen, my apartment dark except for the computer's glow. A diary entry, part of a collection donated to the Rhode Island Historical Society in 1959, the author anonymous, but the handwriting matching samples I had found of Jonathan Wickham's business correspondence. It was dated April 3, 1895. Attended the Thorne house today to deliver the portrait. Found Mrs. Thorne alone in the parlor, Mr. Thorne absent on business, she said, though her eyes would not meet mine. She wept when I unveiled it. Said it was perfect. Said it was exactly as she remembered them. I did not have the heart to tell her that memory is a liar. The children in that photograph are not her children. They are her memory of her children. The good children. The still children. The children who smiled for the camera and did not fidget. Who would have lived if only they had listened, if only they had stayed off the ice, if only they had been more careful, more obedient, more perfect. I have given her a lie made real. I have stolen moments from before the accident and stitched them together into an after that never happened. But perhaps that is what she needed. Perhaps that is what we all need in the end. A beautiful lie to hang on the wall and look at when the truth becomes unbearable. Thorne and I agreed we would not speak of the methods. That we would tell no one how we achieved such seamless composition, how we made the dead and the living occupy the same frame. But I cannot stop thinking about it. Cannot stop seeing them in the negatives, the way their images seem to resist the fixer, to hold on longer than they should. The way Catherine's hand would not print clearly no matter how many attempts I made, as if some part of her refused to be made whole again. The way Samuel appeared in two frames that should have been exposed weeks apart, his expression identical, as if he had never moved, as if he had been waiting to be called back. We have done something wrong. Something that feels like photography but is not. We have opened a door that should remain closed. I feel them watching me from the finished print. I dream of drowning. The diary had no further entries. The collection notes said the diary had been found in Wickham's effects after his death at Butler Hospital, along with several glass plate negatives he had broken with his hands, cutting himself badly, and a single photograph of his son Samuel, the image scratched over and over with what appeared to be a fingernail, the boy's face obliterated, as if the father had tried to erase him completely. I stopped researching after that. I stopped everything. I did not leave my apartment for 6 weeks. I had groceries delivered, left the boxes outside my door until hunger forced me to bring them in. I kept every light on even during the day, even when sleeping. I covered all my mirrors with sheets. I covered my windows. I unplugged my television, turned my phone face down, avoided any surface that might reflect an image back at me. But I could not stop seeing that photograph. In my mind it was endlessly detailed, more clear than any memory should be. The father's hand gripping the mother's shoulder. The girls in their sailor dresses, Catherine with both hands visible now, both complete. The boy in his velvet suit, his shoes no longer doubled, standing slightly to the left to reveal the message painted on the backdrop. We are waiting. 2 words that changed everything, that transformed a family portrait into an invitation, a summons, a promise. On March 17th, the anniversary of the drowning, I woke at dawn to find a photograph on my kitchen table. I lived alone. My door was locked, bolted, chained. The windows were painted shut. I had checked them obsessively. No one had keys except the landlord, and he was out of state visiting family. I had not heard anything during the night, not a sound, not a whisper of movement. But there it was. An albumin print, 11 by 14 inches, mounted on cardstock with beveled gilt edges. The studio mark read Thorne and Wickham, Photographic Artists, Providence, Rhode Island. The cardstock was pristine, not aged as if it had been printed yesterday. It showed a family. Father standing, mother seated, 2 daughters, 1 boy, and 1 other figure. Me. Standing beside the father, my hand resting on the back of the mother's chair. Wearing clothes I did not own, had never seen except in photographs. A high-collared dress of gray wool, leg of mutton sleeves, the fashion of 1895. My face had the glassy stillness of a long exposure, that Victorian quality of someone told to hold very, very still. My eyes stared at nothing. Or at something I could not now remember seeing. Or at the camera. At myself, looking at the photograph 130 years later, the moment I would find it, the moment I would understand. The image was seamless. No joins. No discontinuities. No evidence of composite printing. I looked for my seams, the places where I had been cut from my time and pasted into theirs, but there was nothing. I was simply there. Had always been there. Would always be there. On the back, in faded pencil, a date, April 1895. And below that, in fresh ink, in handwriting I recognized as my own though I had no memory of writing it, March 2025. I am writing this now because I do not know how much time I have left. The photograph sits on my table. Every day I look at it, trying to find the trick, trying to understand the method, trying to find the explanation that will let me dismiss it as a hoax or a delusion. Every day it shows me standing with them. Every day my figure in that image becomes a little clearer, a little more defined, the focus sharpening, the details emerging. This morning I looked in the mirror, I had uncovered just one needing to shave, and saw albumin. My skin has taken on that glossy quality, that particular sheen of egg white dried on paper and varnished to preserve it. When I move, there is a slight lag as if I am waiting for the exposure to complete, as if my motion is being captured at a slow shutter speed. My eyes do not blink as often as they should. When I do blink, I can feel the movement, conscious of it in a way I never was before, as if each blink is being counted, as if I have only so many left. The smell has returned. Hypofixer, sulfurous and chemical. And beneath it, something organic and faintly sweet. Like flowers left too long in a closed room. Like the air in a funeral parlor after the service has ended and the mourners have gone. I think I understand now what Wickham understood, what drove him mad in Butler Hospital, scratching at walls with bleeding fingers. A photograph is not a copy of a moment. It is the moment itself, captured and fixed and held. The people in a photograph are not representations. They are presences. Actual presences pulled from time and trapped in silver and light, aware in some diminished way, waiting. And if the photograph is a lie, a composite assembled from pieces that should not fit together, from moments that never coexisted, from the living and the dead stitched into false unity, then what is trapped inside is neither living nor dead. It is something else. Something hungry. Something that wants to be completed, that needs one more piece to make the image true. They needed one more figure to balance the composition. One more presence to witness. One more piece to make the lie complete or to transform it into truth. I am that piece. The photograph calls to me now, though it makes no sound. I feel it in absences, in the spaces where I should be but am not. I feel it in the seam running through my life, the discontinuity I have always sensed, the feeling that